So, hello everybody. Welcome to this third dialogue between us, Yuichiro Takeuchi of Sony Computer Science Labs, and my name is Dan Hill, the Director of Melbourne School of Design here at the University of Melbourne. I'm joined by my colleagues Rochus Hinkel and Rachel Carey here, also from the University of Melbourne. And hopefully in a moment we'll have Masa Funabashi from Sony Computer Science Labs Tokyo joining us as well. He's on his way in here. I'm just going to share my screen and outline a bit of the agenda for today and the purpose of what we're here to do. And then we'll do some quick introductions around the room. So this is a dialogue that Yuichiro and I have been working on for a while now. We've known each other for some years, and we thought it would be interesting to bring together Sony Computer Science Labs, which Yuichiro will explain in who they are and what they do in a moment, and then the University of Melbourne and various faculties actually working together around this. Before we get going, in Australia, when we open a meeting, we usually start with an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're meeting here in Melbourne, at least, which are the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin nations, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. What we're going to do in a moment is go through a series of presentations. Well, actually, we'll do some quick introductions first, very briefly, and then we'll hear from a set of speakers. And Yuichiro will set the scene a little bit, and then I'll explain some of my research interests here that we can bring to the table, and then we'll hear from Rachel, Masa, and Rochus in that order, and hopefully, of course, leave some time for discussion towards the end. The point of this is to try to find some points of connection between us all as researchers, and we've curated a set of people that we think have potential points of connection at least. And let's see if we get there, but also no pressure. If we just have an interesting discussion and listen to each other speak, that's also fine. So if we walk away and we say, well, that was great, but we didn't particularly find anything that we might do together, that's great, but hopefully we will. And judging by the first couple of sessions, we have many points of emerging contact already, actually. So briefly to explain where we're coming from in Melbourne, at least, we're sitting here in the Japanese room and garden. If you're wondering why you can see shoji screens and tokonoma in the background, it's because we're in this interesting room here in the Melbourne School of Design building, designed by Professor Shigeru Yura in the 1960s when he was a visiting professor here. And he kindly left us behind an entire room designed in a Japanese style. So you can see that in the background, and there's a garden out the window as well. I'd say it's actually quite a Western room, as Japanese rooms go in reality, but it certainly has lots of Japanese touches. Whereas I think Yuichiro, as he'll explain in a moment, is in an actual Japanese room in Kyoto. And hello, Masa. I can see you've joined us also from Tokyo. I see you on the screen now. So welcome. We're just doing introductions, Masa. So I'll come to you in a moment for a very brief introduction. So just to briefly get going, my name is Dan Hill, as I said, and I'm an interaction designer and system designer by background, and I've worked for many years with cities in particular. Maybe I'll also quickly throw to Rachel to say hello and say where you are and where you come from.
Hi, so I'm Rachel Carey. I'm a senior lecturer in food systems here at the university in the School of Agriculture and Food, and I'm from the UK originally, but I've been here in Australia for a very long time, 20 years.
Yeah, and then Rochus.
Hi, I'm Rochus. I'm an associate professor in the School of Design and in architecture and design. My background is actually starting from furniture design and interior architecture to architecture. And I've been same place as you've been, in Stockholm for 5 years at the Art Academy, interior architecture, and then in Germany at the University for Artistic Design.
Great, thank you. And Masa, would you like to say hello and where you are and what you do?
Hi, konnichiwa. I'm Masa Funabashi from Sony Computer Science Lab. Yeah, I'm just connecting from Tokyo, but I'm working in Japan, also doing some field experiments in Africa, and also some urban area, principally in Japan for the last couple of years because of COVID. But I'll be pleased to share my work today. Yeah.
Yes, great, thank you. And yeah, we met very briefly when I was in Tokyo last year, and you just returned from one of your trips to Africa, I think. You were still wearing your large, wide-brimmed hat, I remember when I...
That's from Vietnam, actually. I went...
Oh, it's Vietnam. Okay, there we go. I knew it wasn't Tokyo, that's all. So, Yuichiro, would you like to actually sort of do your introduction and also your opening framing slides? That would be great.
Sure. Let me share my screen now. Okay, so can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
So thank you again for joining the workshop. It's a great honor to be a part of this. And so I'm Yuichiro Takeuchi. I'm a researcher at Sony CSL Kyoto, and I'm joining from this nice little like a tea house or tea room that we have in our lab. I can show you around a little bit, but well, I don't know, not much to see, but it's a tea room. So there's this kettle thing over here. I don't know how you call it in English, but
yeah, kettle will do. Kettle will do.
Kettle. Yes. So yeah, I want to briefly talk about like so me and Masa from Sony, and like we like to briefly introduce ourselves, like who we are and who I am and what we wish to gain from the workshop and those kind of things. So I guess we have a truncated session today, so we should hurry. So I can pretty much skip this slide. I think you guys know about Sony, but basically we are a large company that's headquartered in Japan. And I think one thing that characterizes Sony is that the pictures you see on the right side of the screen are products that Sony has sold over the years, a very small sample, but we are a company that's like constantly launches like a new product lines and constantly enters new markets. Like this constant change, I think that's what characterizes, one thing that characterizes Sony as a company. Me and Masa both belong to a division called Sony CSL, that's short for Sony Computer Science Lab. And we are an R&D division that was founded in 1988. And we have 4 branches, 2 in Japan and 2 in Europe, Paris and Rome. And we've always had this kind of a freewheeling culture. So when you join Sony CSL, you're not really assigned to any existing project. You have the freedom to come up with your own research topic. And so we have now we have 4 branches full of people who are pretty much doing their own thing. And I think the fact that a lab like Sony CSL is allowed to exist within Sony's corporate structure, I think is a reflection of the fact that, as mentioned earlier, Sony is a company that constantly it launches new product lines and enters new markets. So I think the company feels the need to not just do research that directly contributes to Sony's existing business, but to investigate what lies outside of what Sony is known for right now. And so speaking about myself, I am a computer scientist working at CSL Kyoto, the Kyoto branch of Sony CSL. And I am a computer scientist by training. So I got my PhD from the University of Tokyo. But after I got my PhD, I also got a master's degree from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, which is an architecture and urban design school. And so I've been interested in the intersection of those fields like computer science, architecture, and urban design. And right now in Kyoto, I'm leading this project called the Wikitopia project, which is an interdisciplinary project whose goal is to realize future cities that can be edited by everyone, like Wikipedia. So just like when you find problems with Wikipedia, you can edit articles, or you can even write your own articles from scratch. And in the same way, we're imagining cities that the future where people can if they found problems in the cities, they can fix them themselves or in collaboration with other citizens. So we're trying to bring this a democratic mode of production that you see in the online world to the real physical urban design. And if I put it that way, it might sound very abstract, but in practice, of course, like a citizen-led urbanism or urban design in the hands of citizens is something that's been practiced all over the world. And you see some pictures. The picture on the left shows something called a parklet in San Francisco. These are roadside parks. You see a chunk of roadside parking space converted into a small park. And the interesting thing about this is that it's not built by the city, it's built by citizens. So the citizens submit a proposal. They want to build a park at this location. This is the design, and this is how we get the funding. This is how we're going to maintain the park and so on. And if the plan, if the proposal gets accepted, they get permission to build a city, build a park. Sorry, and the city doesn't provide any funding or personnel, but they get the permission, and citizens have the permission, get permission to build and maintain this park themselves. And that is just one example. And there are many, many examples of this kind of DIY urbanism, like guerrilla gardening, like converting open lots into vacant lots into gardens and such. And these pictures all show like examples of North America, but DIY urbanism is something that's practiced all over, pretty much in every corner of the world, including Japan. So what we were doing with the Wikitopia project is we are trying to like learn from these existing practices. And we are investigating how we can use technology to further facilitate these kind of activities. So we're asking questions like, can we use technology to lower the hurdles toward participation, like lower the psychological hurdles towards citizen participation, for example? Or can we use technology to increase the scale and the variety of artifacts that can be created by citizens? Or can we use technology to resolve conflicts or reduce conflicts among citizens, or to help reach consensus and so on. And today, like again, we have to hurry, so I'm not going to talk about everything that we're doing within the project, but I think we will be hearing a lot about food production and sustainability today. And unfortunately, I don't really have any project that's directly related to like either food production or sustainability, but I have one project that deals with like urban gardening, so I think I'll briefly introduce that project. So quite a few years ago, we were doing a lot of experiments with 3D printing, and we found that we printed like a fine 3D mesh structure out of this rather esoteric polymer material. Then the printed volume acts as a soil substitute, meaning that you can if you place plant seeds on the top of the volume, and if you add water and light, eventually the seeds will sprout and you get this like a lush vegetation. And well, of course, like plants growing on artificial material, that's nothing new. Like plants can grow on a lot of things like sponge or like a nylon felt or anything, but we found a technique to 3D print material like volumes with similar properties. So you get the like freedom of form and other benefits that's associated with 3D printing. And building on this finding, we are creating this pipeline where users can design like miniature gardens on a PC, so they can define the overall geometry, and they can also define like the plant layout, what plants you want to grow on which area of the miniature garden. And then the printer prints out this like a volume, and also like places a very simple mechanism, but places seeds on top of the volume. And then if you provide water and sunlight, eventually the plants will grow and you get this miniature garden. And so the goal of this project is completely unrelated to either sustainability or food production. And actually you can grow some sort of food. I'm kind of scared to actually eat them because of the, I don't know, microplastic and everything. But yeah, but our goal is more like about we wanted to kind of devise a novel form of urban gardening that might be more attractive in certain situations. And but like I don't know, I think I shouldn't get too ahead of myself, but well, looking at the way 3D printing technology has been advancing very rapidly, even in recent years, I think eventually we will get to a point where we can create like the habitats, like entire habitats where that support not just plant growth, but also like a variety of life forms, like sorry, like small animals or insects, birds, fish, perhaps like bacteria, fungi, maybe. So we'll be able to 3D print like a nature, so to speak. And whether that kind of like a manufactured artificial nature sounds like dystopian or utopian, I think that depends on the person. But I think technology-wise, we'll eventually get there. So that, yeah, that's my work in a nutshell. And well, thanks again for joining this workshop. And again, like Dan mentioned, if this ends up being just a nice little chat, that's fine as well. But ideally, this will lead to something long-term, like long-term collaboration between Sony and the University of Melbourne, and will lead to. I'm hoping that this will lead to a large-scale collaboration regarding like 21st century urbanism.
Mm.
So that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Arigatou gozaimasu. Thank you, Yuichiro. That was great. And already interesting. Rochus's work sometimes involves fabrication, so maybe there's an interesting parallel already emerging there. So, and a lot of our other work is to do with nature. And as you said, that's a complex set of questions there already about utopia, dystopia, and can we introduce technology and sort of artificial forms of fabrication alongside natural environments? Really interesting, challenging thought already. So I will quickly do the same. I'm going to just show my slides in terms of some potential research framing. And my work has a lot to do with what you might call social infrastructures, things like streets or a bar here, which is both a bar on the street, I guess, at the same time, and the value of those things in urban environments. But I'll also just quickly frame some text here. Yuichiro and I are working on some text, not a manifesto, because that's a bit too didactic, but some words nonetheless, just to position ourselves differently to how technology in the city usually is talked about, and how the smart city movement in particular has usually made a series of errors, in my view, and just to place it. So whether you agree or not is entirely up to you, of course, but I would argue, cities are to do with culture and community and conviviality, perhaps commerce, and the way they interact with natural systems. And so when culture and nature comes together is where we tend to start building settlements. They're both super local, to do with particular places, but they're also increasingly understood as part of planetary scale flows. I mean, food is a very interesting way of thinking about something that's very local and also has global flows within it at the same time. But what it means is that buildings and infrastructures and technologies are really the enablers of those things. They're not the point of cities, but they facilitate things like culture and community. That's one repositioning already, and it's a bit of a 180-degree flip from how the smart city movement usually sees it, which is to focus on the tech, or sometimes as architecture tends to see it, which is to focus on the building, as opposed to the point of the building, which is to produce culture or interaction of some kind. So instead, we're interested in, can we work with the intelligence, creativity, and resourcefulness of a place's inhabitants, human and otherwise? So that could be non-human inhabitants as well, and bringing that into the city. And then there is a possibility here around technologies, which are about producing diverse, open, convivial, resilient cultures, as opposed to the opposite. So a much shorter way of saying all of that would be Cedric Price's quote from 1966, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And so we're trying to dig in a bit deeper and say, what are the points of these things instead of jumping straight to the tech in this case. So in that light, some possible threads from my point of view, at least, would be looking at these kinds of neighborhood scale social infrastructures, and how they come together in a place, what difference they make. Do they produce community or social fabric? How might they do that? What does this bar do in this part of Tokyo, for instance? Or what does this library do in this part of Yantai in China? This is a library as a living room, but it's also clearly many other things at the same time. Libraries can be places to run your business from, or if you're a homeless person, it can be to go and get a wash, or it can be place to meet, or just to hang out, or read a book, or make something. It's all of those things at the same time. So it's doing multiple types of activities as a kind of living room for the neighborhood. Microgrids and renewable energy systems, as we heard yesterday from Yuichiro's colleague Daisuke, increasingly small local scale things. So this is a development in Perth, Western Australia, solar cells on the roof and battery in the basement, and it's moving the energy around within the block between 4 apartments, for 2 apartments in each building, about 4 buildings. And so this is then actually a social system as well, because let's say if I live next door to Rachel and I've used too much energy during the day and then Rachel can't cook pasta at night, or whatever you want to do, then we have a social problem actually. And there's a way of dealing with that, and a number of ways of dealing with it. In this development in Perth, there's actually a blockchain-based system for moving the energy around, which is arguably a little bit opaque. It's difficult to read unless you know it. It maybe doesn't generate trust. It maybe sidesteps the question of trust. Another way you could build the system would just be to encourage Rachel to knock on my door and say, Dan, why did you use all the kilowatts today? Perhaps we can share them a bit more effectively, and we build a social relationship over the energy relationship. And that's then producing energy at the same time as social fabric. So there's a way of designing that, which is then as much to do with anthropology or sociology or interaction design as it is to do with engineering and moving electrons around. So we haven't had to think about that for quite a long time, but now the energy systems are moving in different ways at different scales. It foregrounds that question immediately. Same with this autonomous shuttle. This is in Finland. It's designed to work in very cold temperatures, of course, but maybe it's less useful in the middle of a city where we already have good public transport if it's Finland or Japan, not so in Melbourne, but anyway. But perhaps it's useful where you don't have good public transport, as in low density environments where you can't really afford to run a bus, whereas an autonomous shuttle could be useful in that environment. So it's not displacing any existing transport there. It's actually adding to it. And because the big expense of running a bus is the drivers required to do it, actually it enables it maybe to run in villages or low density suburban environments where currently, again, you can't afford to run sort of high density public transport systems. So it entirely depends on how you frame this technology of autonomous vehicles in this case. Of course, if you build autonomous mobility into private cars, then a very different outcome. You maybe produce congestion and all kinds of stuff. So this is a great project by Studio Sidiana, which is a park really, and it's built in a parking lot in Stockholm where Rochus and I used to live. This is at Arkdes. But this park is designed for birds as much as for humans. So it's kind of equally for the ducks or geese as it is for the humans. And you'll see it's designed in that way by humans. So who knows what ducks really want, but it's based on obviously research and working with animals a lot. So it's kind of interesting and makes you think about how do we live alongside humans in these kinds of, humans and animals at the same time. And these social infrastructures, they're not just social for people, but also social for ducks and people together. Or this bathhouse, which are, sento in Japan, which is of course key to a lot of neighborhoods, but has been disappearing from Japanese neighborhoods over years to some degree, although they're still obviously in many neighborhoods. This one's in Collingwood, around the corner from us where we sit here in Melbourne. And it has the same kind of everyday kind of social infrastructures around it. It's not a fancy spa, it's just an everyday bathhouse. So they also produce a kind of social fabric. So what are all of these things? How do they work? Often places are not built with these in mind as the key things. They usually follow things like housing and office buildings, which is often how cities are built in the first instance. But these are the things that actually produce social fabric and community and conviviality again. And you see this is just a short snapshot I produced for some students in Oslo, but it's a very rich and diverse set of things. You'll find something interesting in there, I guess. And then also a question now, this is a project I worked on last year, which is in Japan, Sosono City, which is a new city built from scratch by Toyota, which is built around these kinds of technologies of super local renewable energies and autonomous buses and things like that. So when we're building new cities, it's the question of how do we build them? What social infrastructures do you need? Is a bus also a social infrastructure as well as mobility at the same time? And it's similar to the way we're thinking about how we might retrofit suburbs here in Melbourne or regional towns. This is work by our colleague Rory Hyde, who's an associate professor, just beginning to sketch out, well, if you add a smart grid or a microgrid to it, does that begin to produce different kinds of connections? And then you start thinking about other things like kindergartens or nurseries and car sharing systems and so on, into environments, as you can see in the background, that actually have very few amenities usually designed into them, sadly. And this is this balancing act of kind of functional things and things to do with culture or social life. I like this quote from Rebecca Solnit, who talks about the street and how it's about errands, as in functional things, jobs to be done, like delivering the milk to the coffee shop. That's a functional thing the street needs to do. But it's also about the epiphany, which is the magical thing, the unexpected thing, the romantic thing, the poetic thing, whatever it might be. That also happens in streets. That also happens in coffee shops, sometimes in bathhouses as well. And so it's this balancing act of those things at the same time, as opposed to the street just being about the functional side. So secondly, about how do we design for that kind of adaptation and participation in these things, or circularity? There's a lot of interesting work in Japanese cities about that, and of course in Australian and other cities as well. A project I was involved in Sweden about retrofitting streets. We were doing participative work at the Prime Minister level. That's the Swedish Prime Minister on the left. But we also did it with school kids, and actually the same exercise. And in reality, we let the school kids be the designers of the street, not the Prime Minister. Actually, we were just seeing how that would work with the Prime Minister. But actually, the school kids got to redesign their own streets in this way. And school kids are fantastic designers, and it led to this project were like using parklets in the way that Yuichiro described, a kind of tactical urbanism project, but designed by 6-year-olds actually, in terms of what would happen there, what kind of applications might get built. Is it forests or parking or pram places or scooter parking or places to sit and so on. You saw they were built in wood because that enables this adaptability, and you see with these structures called kawadoko in Kyoto, which are built as kind of extensions of bars into the river, almost like a parklet, but built out into the river, built in wood and simple materials like steel and other things that people can acquire quite quickly. And these are kind of homemade by the bars themselves, essentially, and they disappear and they come and go depending on the season. You also see in Japan people taking care of the street themselves directly, this kind of street gardening, and how people, given half a chance, will immediately try to produce a garden there, even if it's only 1 meter of space. Then I'll try and make it as dense as possible. So how do we design places that enable people to take care of them? And then using wood and other materials, of course, enables this ongoing adaptation. These are the Ise temples in Japan, which are roughly 1,300 years old, but rebuilt every 20 years and have been for 1,300 years. So by making them rebuilt every 20 years, they actually last forever, whereas, or conceivably forever. Whereas when we try to build things for long term, they maybe last for only 80 years or so. So actually building in adaptation, and here using wood again, enables that change. Third, this kind of culture of decision-making or technology. How do we decide to live and work together and share spaces or make shared decisions about shared things? The street project in Sweden was really a platform for asking questions about the future of the street. And we could do that with participants, with the public on board. We did a similar project with Ericsson and UN Habitat, which was an augmented reality platform for city planning. I'm showing you not the interface itself, because that's kind of, that comes and goes, right? But actually the reaction of the kids that were involved in designing their city using Minecraft actually, and then overlaying it onto the city. You see the delight in their eyes, because this is the first chance they've ever had to say, you get to design the city. It was, you know, it's not something that they could imagine they could be part of, it's their own city. You can also do that in very low-tech ways, like just like doing a better drawing and putting that in public and then hosting it in a different way. These are all technologies. And then with food in mind, we did a big project in Sweden looking at how school kids could redesign the way that food happens. School food is an enormous system in Sweden. Every kid eats it basically at the public schools. Similar in Japan, I know. And within that, we were looking at how food could be used to actually shift regenerative farming behind it, how it could enable sustainable logistics, how it binds the school into the community, how you might use food waste in the community around, or vice versa, have the community farming inside the school grounds, or teaching with the food in other classes and so on. And they were all built off the back of, again, getting kids involved in the process directly. So this was then redesigning their school canteen, working with architects and designers to design a school canteen, not as a functional space purely, but also an enjoyable space. Or why would it not be a bit like a restaurant, in fact? So this asks this question about who decides, who's in charge of making these decisions. And at the, what I would call the 1-minute end of things, you can have a lot of participation. At the 60-minute end of things, the larger scale systems, it's a more representative culture. It's to do with big systems like subways and grids. Systems like energy, though, are interestingly moving to the smaller end of things. You have microgrids, and maybe food is another interesting system, which could also be super local. It was super local for a very long time, and then it's become more industrialized and large scale in countries like Australia quite often. But you also have these 15-minute, 30-minute city, these kind of points in between where they're a little bit local or a bit participative, but also with farming and industrial logics as well. So my last point then is just about reframing technology itself. And what do we mean by technology? Just to kind of open up the field a bit. And I like this quote from the science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin, who said the definition of technology, in her mind at least, is the active human interface with the material world. So that doesn't necessarily, you know, she's not talking about technology equals Facebook or technology equals a camera, but actually it's a much broader definition of anything that we've made as a way of interfacing with the material world. So it would include obviously the tools of agriculture in that sense, or the tools of interaction or mobility systems. So just to make that super clear, and where that maybe goes is, this is obviously a technology. This is the omniprocessor outside Dakar, which takes sewage in. So it takes dirty water in and turns it into clean drinking water. Amazing thing, and it, deeply technological in the traditional sense, as you can see. But the East Kolkata wetlands on the right there is also a technology, because that did not exist before humans shaped it in that way. It's a series of wetlands where the water kind of rolls down a hill through natural filtration systems. It also is cleaning the water, and it takes in 700 million tons of sewage a day, whereas the omniprocessor does 14 tons of sewage a day. So I'm not saying the omniprocessor is bad, by the way, it's a good thing. And it potentially it's more scalable than the wetlands. But if you look at what the wetlands is also doing, not just an enormous scale of system, it's also producing 13,000 tons of fish and 16,000 tons of rice and all of those vegetables. It's holding 80,000 jobs. It's performing biodiversity. It's protecting the city from storms and so on. It's doing numerous other things at the same time. But again, it does not exist naturally, even though it's kind of made of nature. It's shaped by humans. Therefore, I would say it is a technology. So it's kind of just to kind of open up our field here. And of course, in Australia, there's a long, as in 67,000 years long understanding of working with nature as a form of technology and a culture and a spiritual thing all at the same time, which we might wrap up in the word country. But these kind of systems are both agricultural technologies like Bujbim, but also spiritual and cultural ritualistic systems at the same time. So I will leave it there, just to say that frames the conversation hopefully for where we might go in terms of understanding a much broader idea of technology, and then beginning to locate it in cities as kind of social and cultural thing. All right. So, sorry, I'm going so fast today. I don't know why I'm going so fast. Now I think if we could hear from some of our guest speakers, that would be great, because that's Yuichiro and I's kind of framing out the way. And Rachel, perhaps I could ask you to kick us off and share a bit of your work with us.
Yes, thank you, Dan. It's really great to have the opportunity to think about how my work fits into these big picture issues. I'm just going to try to share my screen now. I just need to get this in presentation mode. Okay. Oh,
there we go.
Yeah, there we go. Just catching up. So I am going to connect to the technology theme a bit that you've been talking about by talking about how I am borrowing from some of the tools and techniques that have been used in technology design, especially in user-centered design of technologies, and thinking about how we can apply those to co-designing food systems and policy for more sustainable and resilient food systems. So I'm a senior lecturer, as I said, in food systems, meaning that I look at, investigate everything that happens from the farm to the fork in feeding people. And I do that using integrated food systems approaches that consider how different parts of the food system interact with each other and how that affects food system outcomes such as food security, and also how those outcomes are influenced by many different drivers and by many different policy portfolios within government. So my research on food systems encompasses many different areas, but I'm going to focus here on one particular area of my research, which is my research on co-design of policy approaches for sustainable and resilient city food systems, because I think that intersects quite nicely with some of the other work that you're talking about. So this work really draws on user-centered design processes and tools that have more commonly been used in technology design. And I do that partly, my interest here in co-design of food systems comes from my background. So before I became a food systems academic, I had an earlier career in human-centered design of technologies. So working on user interface design for various different types of devices, mobile devices, interactive TV, and working in Australia and in London as well, and using participatory design techniques. So my interest in this area really comes from that background, and now I'm adapting those human-centered design techniques and tools with colleagues to co-design a policy for more resilient and sustainable food systems. So I'm going to talk specifically about one project and try and get a bit concrete and show you examples of how that actually works. So I am working on complex food system problems, such as how can we strengthen the resilience of the food system in a city like Melbourne to shocks and stresses from climate change and pandemic, or from natural resource pressures, or how can we develop policy frameworks that are effective in keeping fresh food production on the fringe of a rapidly growing city like Melbourne in the face of a whole range of challenges such as rapid population growth, water scarcity in a warming climate, and all the economic pressures that are on farmers too, from falling farm gate prices and rising input costs. So the problem of retaining fresh food production on the fringe of a city crosses multiple different policy portfolios, including things like urban planning and water and agriculture and economic development, as well as things like health. And this is one of the infographics that we've developed. We use a lot of infographics to communicate ideas, and this is one of them. So I've been leading a project called the Foodprint Melbourne project since 2015, which is focusing particularly on the context of Melbourne's city region and these complex food system problems within that region. And over the last 7 years, myself and colleagues have been generating evidence that really aims to shift our understanding of what these sorts of policy problems are. And we've co-designed several what we're calling policy roadmaps with stakeholders that aim to address these complicated food system problems in a more integrated sort of way. And just to give you a feeling for the sorts of organisations that are involved, this project is funded by the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, which is actually the biggest community philanthropic foundation in Australia. And we collaborate with a broad range of project partners, including the City of Melbourne, and including other local governments around Melbourne, and a range of civil society groups as well, who all sit on this stakeholder advisory group for the project. So the sort of research that I'm talking about here is really kind of highly engaged research, certainly from an academic perspective, by which I mean that we are partnering with stakeholders in the public sector, private and community sectors to co-develop alternate visions for more sustainable, resilient, healthy and equitable food systems, particularly within Melbourne city region. And I'm especially interested in the role of universities as convening spaces for research that actively engages in promoting sustainable food systems by creating a policy space outside of government, where we can bring stakeholders into a different space to consider these complex problems in different ways, using co-design approaches that are got potential, I think, to open up new ways of thinking about the problems, new ways of thinking about what the potential solutions might be. And I'm going to talk about how we use a few of these tools and techniques in policy co-design that are borrowed from the youth-centered design of technologies, and what some of the outcomes of these processes are. So just first of all, what I mean by policy co-design, I'm going to use quite a lot of the words that have been used earlier on. It's a collaborative and participatory process, and a design-led process that uses tools from the design field to solve policy problems, bringing together people from different sectors, and in particular, having a focus on involving people who are typically impacted by the policy that's being developed, of course, through the Scandinavian tradition of participatory design approaches that have long been used in human-centered design of technologies, and involves the use of tools like scenarios to envision and tell stories, modeling and mapping to prototype solutions to complex problems, and, as I said, has the potential, I think, to open up alternative thinking. The approach has been applied elsewhere in things like energy transitions, and also by others in the context of food systems. I think in particular, it's got good potential for addressing these complex food system problems where potential solutions really need to involve people from across different stages of the food system or food supply chains and from multiple different government policy portfolios as well. So I'm going to start to get a bit more concrete about what we've actually been doing using this one example. So in 2018-19, we used this approach to bring together stakeholders from across Melbourne's food system, including farmers, together with policy stakeholders from local and state government, to see if we could develop an integrated policy roadmap for a more resilient and sustainable city food bowl. And when I use that term food bowl, what I mean is the farmland around the fringe of the city, which includes the peri-urban farmland areas and what we often call Melbourne's green wedges. It's around a 100-kilometre radius around the city. So we started the process by carrying out interviews and gaining insights into the process. Then we ran 5 half-day workshops with stakeholders. We have around 20 participants, up to 20 people in each workshop, and we involved just over 60 people in the whole process. And we brought in a co-design expert to help us with the process and to run the workshops. And we had a series of workshops. So the first 2 really focused on envisioning solutions to farm viability challenges on the city fringe. The second 2 workshops focused on designing solutions to increase the resilience of farming in Melbourne's food bowl to climate change. And we're trying to work in this process where we've got a kind of diverge process going on of brainstorming, creating lots of different ideas, and then converging and developing some of those ideas further. We've had people from multiple sectors involved, so people from agriculture, water, urban planning, waste sectors working together on cross-disciplinary teams to look at the problems. We've used design techniques like brainstorming, prototyping, model building, sometimes building 3D models, and using scenarios to give context, and I'll show you a few examples of those. After the first 4 workshops, where participants had envisioned ideas about what integrated policy should aim to achieve, we then took all the ideas into a final workshop and drafted up a rough set of policy recommendations that emerged from those ideas. So I'll show you a few examples now of the tools that we use. So we've used scenarios in different ways through this process. This is an extract from what we call a future context scenario, a kind of overarching scenario of what Melbourne might be like in 2040 in the context of climate change. And we use this to focus teams on how we might plan to ensure that Melbourne's food growing area, its food bowl, is resilient in a world where there's at least 1.5 degrees of warming, more severe heat waves and droughts, and growing water scarcity. And we also gave teams maps of areas of what I'm calling Melbourne's food bowl, this food growing area, and they've used plasticine, pipe cleaners, matchsticks, post-its to plan for how food production in the area could be made more resilient in the context of this scenario of climate change. So teams with experts from water, waste, land use planning, and farmers plan solutions that focused on things like efficient reuse of water and nutrient waste streams on farm, and that highlighted policy gaps in circular food economies at a city level. So we're kind of doing some city scale planning here. We've also had people draw sketches, design ideas. Sometimes this one's from a workshop focused on farm viability, where a group looked at how new residential developments in areas already zoned for housing might be designed with farms at their centre, through where the community might support the farm through a community supported agriculture model, rather than the typical model in Melbourne where the farm goes and then the residential development comes in place. So on the right is an example of a more concrete concept development that fleshes out who might need to be involved in this concept, what would actually need to happen for this to come through. And this envisioning process then led to a set of draft policy recommendations and a policy roadmap. And this is the overarching policy framework that came out of this whole process. So the point here is that it's a very integrated framework, which thinks about what would actually need to happen across 5 different policy portfolios to address this complicated problem. And so it includes recommendations around things like farmland protection, farm viability, water access, nutrient recycling within the Melbourne region, and sustainable farming approaches as well. And under each of these areas, we have very detailed recommendations. This is just an example of some of the recommendations on nutrient recycling within Melbourne's food bowl as an example. So there's a recommendation here to establish a nutrient recycling network for Melbourne to help match known sources of important nutrients, important to food production, like phosphorus and nitrogen, help match sources of them with demand for those nutrients within the city region. And that recommendation emerged from a mapping exercise where we mapped important food system assets for the region and established a lack of connection between them, a lack of connection between the supply of them and the demand for them. And under each of these recommendations, we have a lot of detail about what needs to happen, why it needs to happen, and who needs to be involved. And we've also found that future vision scenarios can be quite helpful. So we've developed future vision scenarios that describe the outcomes that we might want to see from policy in a narrative form. And this one is just an example of one that we developed for nutrient recycling, but we have lots of these in our policy roadmaps. And we found that they're quite useful. We've noticed, for instance, that when Victorian state government developed their consultation paper around protecting farmland on the fringe of Melbourne, they also had a future vision scenario that used some of the same types of language and words that we had used in our scenario. We've applied this approach to another project more recently to build the resilience of Melbourne's food system to shocks and stresses, where we focused on climate and pandemic shocks, looked at the entire food system from production through to consumption. And we did the whole thing online because this was during the COVID-19 pandemic, and followed a similar sort of process, which again worked very well, even though it was online, although it is challenging to bring the creativity into the process when you're online. So I'm just going to finish off with a few reflections on policy co-design of food systems and on this work. I think from my experience so far that these sorts of policy co-design approaches that borrow from human-centered design do have good potential to generate more integrated policy solutions to complex food system problems. And using some of these creative design techniques has potential to open up alternate visions for transitions to sustainable food systems that are different to the dominant policy narrative. And in doing that, it's also possible to open up different types of policy solutions and to shift the way that policy problems are seen and the range of possible solutions to those problems. I think scenarios in particular can be quite helpful in helping stakeholders to understand future food system challenges and to envision potential solutions and to understand the needs of people affected by the policies, and also that by bringing policymakers out of their usual policy setting into an alternate space, you can start to shift the dynamics in a helpful way during the process, particularly so that civil society actors can be heard. We've also noticed that we're helping people to develop a common language around the issues and build their capacity in food system planning, but there's still some challenges. So I think it's unclear to me at this point to what extent these techniques are leading to more radical transformatory visions for food systems. I think that's a real challenge. How do you open up spaces for that? Can these sorts of approaches lead to more transformatory work? And I think another challenge is how we involve First Nations peoples in these processes of food systems co-design in a way that supports their goals, meets their needs, and where they feel culturally safe. And that's a conversation that's just beginning and has a long way to go. I will stop there.
Thank you, Rachel. That's right. Thanks so much. I mean, that's a really useful framing from one angle. And I wonder, actually, Masa, I'm going to come to you next, because there might be, if Rachel's work is kind of describing the policy framework around food, and as you said, sort of ask the question of how transformational we can get that, I guess some of your work might be on the ground in a kind of transformational mode, but it'd be interesting to see how those two connect, the sort of the policy and done in a bottom-up way, but also with the work that you're doing. So Masa, if I can ask you to give us your presentation, that would be great.
Yeah, so thanks again for the introductory talks, and Rachel for your presentation. That I see a very different context actually in Australia, like involving First Nation people. We don't have this, conception in Japan or in other places like in Africa. Well, so I'd like to introduce briefly what I've been doing, mainly at Sony CSL, but recently involving other university and other companies and associations. And this is a project on sustainable food production, but based on biodiversity and in its most extreme form. So I just first make brief presentation and let's see what's gonna lead us for the discussion. And the principal issue that I want to tackle is the sustainability issues and based on biodiversity. And this is the map published in Science paper that tells us that as long as we expand human society in a conventional manner based on the conventional agriculture method and other heavy industries, we are losing massively the land biodiversity as well as the coastal ecosystem diversity. And the root cause is the actual modality of food production, which is not only in the large-scale monoculture. And we tend to think that large-scale monoculture is hindering nature, which is of course true, but actual demography of the world tells us that the majority of food producers are small scale. And these people are in accumulated effect also negatively contributing to the biodiversity loss. And here is some statistics from FAO. And surprisingly, if we want to change the way that we produce food, we have to actually change the behavior of these smallholders working on like less than 5 hectares. If we entirely remove the majority of the negative effect on the biodiversity. So that's my principal focus on the food production. And since I have background in veterinary medical science and also in complex system physics, I took a very different career from other agronomists like that rather comply with the smart precision agriculture. So I'm trying to the extreme, not the opposite, but the complementary case of small scale farming, and which gives this formula actually. The principal idea is to augment the biodiversity through our means of producing food. So I call it anthropogenic biodiversity. And it is a model of augmenting species diversity in a small farm surface that increase the number of these small farms. So it means to engage people. Those who are living in the urban side can also contribute to this kind of small scale farming, as well as those already engaged in the food production in rather rural area could also introduce this kind of new forms of small scale farming that is based on biodiversity. And the principal ways to produce food with biodiversity is to be based on the biodiversity and the self-organization of ecosystem. And this system, we call it snecoculture based on the snecological, on the term snecology, actually. This is actually the ancient term that divided the ecology between autoecology and snecology. And autoecology is just a matter of one species interacting with the environment, and snecology is just about the community of multiple species interacting between them and also interacting with the environment. So the snecoculture is the matter of using the community-based ecology in the food production. So concretely, this is a small field of about 1,000 square meters that I first experimented in Japan, and in which we associated like more than 200 useful plant species. So there's a lot of already diversity introduced in this field. And there's also emerging weed species and incoming animal species, insects that are making up the whole ecosystem functioning that we call the self-organization. And because we replace all these, functionality, well, we try to replace the conventional usage of plowing and fertilization and agrochemicals with these ecological interactions. And this is a bit complicated to explain, but it's a matter of smartly utilize the community dynamics of plants, first of all, and also the effects of animal fauna for the fertilization and for the effective control of diversity. And in short, it's the matter of creating the ecosystems based on the useful plant species from which we can yield several ecosystem services, including food. So usually agriculture tend to focus just on the input and output relationship in a very technologically precise manner, but they ignore the most part of the richness of complex system, which is known as the biodiversity and ecosystem functions. So this system is rather based on ecology than the conventional agronomical techniques. Yeah, and we use this driving force of ecosystem that is known as ecological succession in the field of ecology. So starting from the bare land, you follow the time step from left to right, and then there is emergence of small grass, and then shrubs, and gradually growing trees because seeds are brought by birds and other animals and so on until it reaches to the dense forest, which is the case of climate in Japan. And since the native forest, well, it is nice, but it's not totally useful for every aspect of economy. So we try to introduce useful plant species, principally food, but also for other objectives if it's for the urban area, like shading trees and drought resistant or absorption of flood, etc. And try to make up highly augmented ecosystems. And this is the concept of synecoculture. And here are some examples from the field. You can see there are some vegetables and fruits that you can also see at supermarket, but taking sometimes different form because they are growing in very wide environment with lots of interactions. And I should go briefly, but I also constructed a mathematical theory that lies behind this productivity is that, okay, if we want to use the monoculture conventional method, it should be actually as the center of this figure, which is environmentally favorable condition for a specific crop. But if there's climate change, or if your land is a bit marginal, or the climate zone is marginal for most of the crops, you should go for with synecoculture because it can produce much more synergy than the competition. And to prove this, theoretical formulation, I actually tried it in a very harsh environment, which is in Burkina Faso. In 2015, I started with local NGO to introduce 150 edible plant species in a desertified land. So this is a region that suffers, the whole region suffers from the desertification. And there's a bunch of studies performed on that. And they say like 50% is the effect of climate change, but the remaining 50% is because the traditional way of their agriculture is like slash and burning, and also there's overgrazing issues locally that actually hinder the regeneration of ecosystem, and that makes the ecosystem impossible to regenerate it if we leave it alone. So we try to revive one of these desertified land with the use of synecoculture. And just after 1 year of introduction of 150 species, actually our field has reestablished a rich ecosystem that are mostly edible, and we had a very large market impact locally. So this is like 3 years comparison pictures. So left is the reference area just at the side of our field that remained bare. Actually, there's a dry season and rainy season, but in each case, there's too less water or too much water, and there's actually no regeneration of plants, even weed. And on the right side, we form a very rich ecosystem by synecoculture, and which can capture the heavy rain as well as tolerating the drought season as well. So you can see the development of soil porous structure. Unfortunately, we don't have precision measurement to measure the difference of this porous structure in African university, but obviously from sand that contain no organic materials, there's a formation of rich soil. So all this was made without any amendment of organic matters. And yeah, so the local impact was very high in terms of the self-sufficient subsistence farming, which was actually sufficient to make local village people to live on that system, as well as resolving the issues of malnutrition. And we are making a kind of national development plan for the dissemination of snake culture, so that the lay people can live on this system as a way of having basic, food, and also have access to stable income with decent work. And this is really needed society in this area. And to disseminate this knowledge, I've been organizing the International Symposium on Snake Culture, which is mainly in French-speaking nations. And we had a great support of Sony and UNESCO and for the organization of that. And we also launched the local NGO called CAFS for the actual dissemination of this knowledge. And now we are expanding the farms of snake culture on the initiative of open source. So we disseminate the knowledge freely, and they start their own development, adaptation, and also making knowledge exchange, and gather once a year for the international symposiums. And there are some international budgets, international projects that also achieved a very satisfactory state in Mali Republic, and we are also starting now in Togo. And now we are having a citizen-led initiatives of that gathers more than 35 countries in the world, and these are from mostly African countries, and it's on the platform of UNESCO and recently Sony, and we are trying to make free knowledge exchange. And all these activities are published now in the form of perspective paper from one of the nature journals, in which I'm developing a context of terraforming this planet with snake culture. So when we talk about food production, there's a very large conventional way of agriculture that is hindering the integrity of global ecosystems. So typically causing the desertification. But on the contrary, snake culture actually can reestablish and even go further in the ecological complexity. So this fits to the extension of terraforming that is much discussed in space technologies, but more in a more livable form, actually, in a highly established state of ecological diversity. And since we didn't have yet the term for that, I'm just calling it human augmentation of ecosystems. And I believe that's something that we have to do, starting from food production, to achieve a livable state of ecosystem globally on this planet. And just bringing back to the urban area that I've been also working intensively in the last couple of years, because I was obliged to stay in Japan. Well, this is actually the publication that I am one of the contributing authors that was published from the World Economic Forum. It's called Biodiversity by 2030. So it's like 10 years objective to achieve as a green infrastructure in the city size. And the report revealed that almost half of the GDP is at the risk of disruption by natural disasters. And we have to massively transform from actual gray concrete infrastructure to the green infrastructure, much like Downhill's presentation, talking about the ecosystem, mitigating flood, and providing much ecosystem service and so on. We have to really convert the landscape of the cities, not only creating some nice parks, but implement strategically the green infrastructures that should replace some of the very important functionality of the cities that support the GDP. And we have been experimenting the potential of augmented ecosystems in rooftop garden of Tokyo, which is in collaboration with Mori Building. And we have this nice rooftop garden with 1 meter depth of soil, because in our country we have a lot of earthquakes. So we have some technical stuff called mass damper. So on top of the high building, we have to put some heavy weight to counterbalance the shaking of the earthquake. And for that weight mass, and we, well, Mori building used the soil actually. So we have a very rich 1 meter soil on the rooftop garden here, in which we experimented augmented ecosystems, introducing more than 200 edible species, and it worked quite well. And what was interesting is that if we measure the microbiodiversity, it was even superior to most of the reference field all over Japan, like including monoculture field, but also natural ecosystems and some other organic field. And it actually means that in order to have a better microbiome environment, which is beneficial for our health and for our immunity especially, we don't need to go to rural area. We can just, create this kind of environment through intensive introduction of plant species and, strategic management to maintain this functionality. And then you can live with this kind of, a very highly augmented environment, microbiome environment, even inside of the city. And this perspective is in one of the publications from Biodiversity Committee. And we even did some clinical evaluation with one of the rehabilitation centers around Tokyo. And it shows the significant amelioration of clinical markers. So not only does the environment become very rich in terms of microbiome diversity, but there might be some connection with this, amelioration of the actual quality of life as well in the elderly people.
Yeah.
All right. So, and to conclude, actually, and we are having this small learning kit called Cineco Portal from Sony CSL, and this is a kind of small brochure that you can follow to create the small augmented ecosystem, and which serve as the interface, and which can also be deployed everywhere inside of the city, or in a garden, or in your schools, and so on, to make actually the ecological networks that, for example, in this picture, a butterfly can fly from the natural mountainside to your Cineco Portal, and going to other Cineco Portals and connect people and with the actual function. And we are also implementing in the middle of Tokyo. This is the exhibition in the Sony Park, and deploying in several areas in Japan at elementary school to have a concrete, education program to teach kids on how to construct diversity, what is the functionality, or what is the use, what could be beneficial for their future. And to promote all these things, last year, Sony, as one of the Sony Group company, I founded the Cineco Inc., which is, for the moment, a consultation company that works on the introduction of Cineco culture. And we are actually deploying the service all over in Japan, several places in China and Africa, and Latin America. It's in Ecuador on the cacao farm. And we are assisting the construction of augmented ecosystem. And we are also providing service for the design of urban green infrastructure. So the illustration is just one of the simulation that we are working with Mori building. And to visualize the functionality and benefits is the upcoming issues, and we are working for that. Yeah, so when we talk about sustainability and biodiversity, we tend to think that natural ecosystem is the greatest example, which I don't disagree, but I believe we can do it better as an augmented ecosystems, that human intervention can also work positively if we carefully plan the issues, and especially if we carefully have dialogue with the communities, we may be able to achieve this kind of augmented state of ecosystem involving human as one of the multi-species dynamics. So I hope the urban area will develop in such a way, and that would be, will bring happiness not only to humans but for other species as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Masa. That's fantastic. So many interesting angles there and an interesting crossover, I think, with Rachel's stuff already, and also a bit of Yuichiro in mind. So, Rochus, can we turn to you now?
So I joined Melbourne University 2020, and I'm here since 3 years. So all the projects you will see have been conceived within that time frame. I founded a research hub. It's Advanced Digital Design Fabrication, together with colleagues who work in the digital design and fabrication spaces. This is normally the work one part of the work I work on, which is about storytelling. So to refer to your quote from Le Guin, I would say that, or to alter that, it's stories who connect us with our culture. And we use various technologies to tell stories about places, people, their artifacts, and their histories. I'm actually not going to show that, it's too long. This is a VR movie which was presented at Ars Electronica in 2020, which tells about our relationship to country, and basically from a colonial or colonizer perspective, and trying to learn from indigenous knowledge and a relationship to country. Creates this environment based on LiDAR scans where a narrator tells a story which is based on literature review, which is here the list on Aboriginal signage and frontier conflict and contact exchange, to give an entry point to how we relate to country, but to open up a conversation what a potential future would be, a post-colonial, which we don't have yet. These are just some screenshots of that. So the imagery we create is not representational in a way, but it refers to actual places, and it creates a bit more an abstract version of where the sound, the sonic and the narrative together with the visual composition creates that imaginary world. So it's not just a visionary based or visual based part. So that was at Ars Electronica. I can share that link if you want to watch VR movies. That's a 22-minute VR movie with, like, that's the data, 70,000 frames, 140 gigabyte. I didn't know what I'm getting into, I have to say. The one I actually think which might relate to this, and I only have a very, very short presentation on that, is developing non-human habitats. So I'm working currently with students on 3D printing or designing non-human habitats for, or more than human habitats for bees, native bees. There are 1,900 different species in Australia. We're working with Amy Haas, who's an urban horticulture expert from Melbourne University in the School of now Agriculture and Forest Science, I think it was called. I'm not sure what it's called now. And then with a research fellow, Rachel Wilson, who is an expert in native bees. And we're using robots and parametric design to basically construct, based on clay printing, prototypes, which we're discussing with Burnley campus, that we set up a scientific series of explorations to document and explore which one would actually work best, which is outside of the explorations with the students. These ones were, so for example, this one is one which was developed for skinks. So students had to do all the research and use personae, not scenarios, but personae to imagine, like, what would it be and what is maybe the need of a skink and the perspective. It has its own problems because we're kind of, implementing or appropriating a skink's perspective, which has ethical issues in a way, but it's, for designers or architects, interesting to actually deal with clients, let's say, who they're not really in control of, and they don't know much about it because we're making so many assumptions about our own habits and project them onto our built environment. So with this one, it's a bit of also an exercise to go, no, we don't actually know. What I've learned is even people in bioscience don't know much about many of the species. So there's a generic or a general interest to actually learn from each other and use what we're doing to explore and understand maybe more about this species by observing then scientific setups. So these were rather ornamental, for example. They're currently exhibited in the National Museum of Australia in Canberra in an art, design, technology exhibition. This one particularly tries to capture water and bring it more underground and store it so it doesn't get dry in that area and create a small microcosm in that underground space. And this was on site, so we did a lot of installations, and they're growing there. It's an elective I do once a year or sometimes twice a year. And we've got a site from University of Melbourne where that is installed, but it's not scientifically installed. So it's more like we go there and see what happens to it. It was flooded and they still exist, different approaches. I'm not going to talk about this one, but maybe what might be interesting is to look at the XR briefly, because that's maybe the connection to future urbanism, in the sense of that I'm interested in how augmented reality can add another layer to our experience of the world. I'm more interested in AR than in VR in a way, but they have their own problems, but also potentials. But I truly believe that AR will become like the next iPhone, and not like VR, which is still just in gaming environments or exhibitions. I think someone should write a manifesto for AR for future urbanism. So it's not all about commerce and regulations and pornography and sales. But that's something I'm really think that art and storytelling could add another layer and experience to that. And this was a project which is based also on teaching, but it's basically a physical model, and one can interact with it through those small models flying in space. There are information layers, and there's also, they use HoloLens, but there's also technology to actually use your own smart device as long as you have internet connection. And this is what you actually see when you look there without having the adaptation of the app, and you see someone looking at a physical artifact, which is overlaid in their perspective with digital information. So that's one of the shots. And those people there is actually another project I'm working on with the indigenous communities at Cape York, or Kola. And we're looking at, so that's up here, all the way up north. Up there comes then Torres Strait, and after that, Papua New Guinea. And it's
on the way to Japan.
Yeah, sort of. We could meet in Papua New Guinea if we get a secure place in a compound. So it's like a day's trip from Cairns to actually get on country. And I'm working with a colleague who has long-term relationships with them. And we're developing currently a case study or a proof of concept on collecting. We've been up there for a field trip, collecting data on the landscapes, their stories and artifacts. And we're going up next week actually to discuss then what is the potential next prototype we develop based on all the data collection we've done over a week at Nukakura. This is Uncle Jack and Uncle Mike, so that's recording them and with a 360 camera and 360 sound, guiding a group of rangers around the site and telling the stories of the site. These were all the technologies we used, so like 360 sound, drone footage, photogrammetry, LiDAR scanning, 360 video recording. That's it.
Fantastic.
Thank you. How did I go? I left us 5 minutes.
You did very well. Thank you so much, Rochus. That was super interesting. And yeah, we have about 5 minutes or so, which is much more compressed than we would like, I know. But I suggest what we can do is we can at least put 1 or 2 ideas on the table that you would like to continue the discussion around, some potential overlap. We'll make a document afterwards, and we'll also connect you all directly, so we can develop that as well in email and through a shared document. So that's what we're doing with the other workshops anyway. So but I wonder if there's one thing from each of us that you would say there's an interesting point of connection. So, you know, for instance, the augmented ecosystems Masa talked about, we just heard a lot about augmented ecosystems from Rochus from completely different angles, but maybe there's an interesting crossover there. With Rachel's work, we heard also beginning to think about First Nations approaches to forms of agriculture and how that happened in Australia. And of course, Masa, your work is no doubt dealing with the difference between the no-till farming that Masanobu Fukuoka would have promoted, and then what actually happened in Burkina Faso, or if you were to point your work at Australia, you'd have to look at First Nations crossed with that no-till farming from Japan in some way, perhaps, I don't know. I guess also school food was interesting, and I know, Rachel, you started to think about that a bit as a site in Australia. It's not so big, whereas school food is quite big in Japan. So that might be another interesting crossover, and of course it brings in technologies as well. But are there things that people want to put on the table? Those are just a few things that occurred to me that anybody wants to lead with. Threads for us to continue afterwards, no doubt.
You leave me that way. Okay. So I found it particularly interesting that we tend to talk sometimes, I believe it's on the same issue, the same ecosystem, or the same aspects of ecosystem with different languages. And I see whether the opportunities are on how to integrate the scientific views with the community-based decision-making process. Because what I see now in Sneko culture is that, okay, the scientific base is done, so we're gonna implement that, and we invite all those people, farmers and non-farmers, to engage in the system, and they start to talk in their own language, sometimes correct, sometimes biased, or sometimes quite biased. I have to make some common universal platform, and I believe like the AR things that you are mentioning is like representing seeing is believing. So it's more like, you know, rather than using mindering words, sometimes it's quite obvious to show the pictures, to show the image, or to show the augmented reality decoration on the actual scientific knowledge to actually foster fruitful discussion among the community. So I think this kind of, you know, making a platform based on scientific data, scientific interpretation, but also open to a very free discussion, interaction, decision-making of the community will be quite interesting, especially in face of the new situation like in Australia. Yeah, that I cannot completely imagine what's going on there. So maybe this kind of open platform is one of the universal things that we tackle together, and also will have potential application in other regions of the world as well. Absolutely. So that's the kind of citizen participation tools that Yuichiro and I are talking about, crossed with the kind of augmented technologies that Rochus talked about, which of course is similar to what you're talking about with your work, Masa, but in the context of a policy lab co-design, the kind of thing that Rachel has done, which brings together numerous stakeholders in different ways. And we can still also use low technologies, like the things you described, pipe cleaners and so on, but also the augmented reality adds, as you said, a kind of a shared experiential approach where it's not just analytical, but it's something, as you said, you feel and you're immersed in to some degree. So that's an interesting crossover, I guess. And also, I'll come to you in a moment, Yuichiro, but I really liked I now know what those sculptures are. I'd seen them outside our building, but I didn't realize they'd come from this skink-based, skink-centered design approach, or working with bees. And so the kind of 3D printed objects is, I guess, close to what Yuichiro started with around 3D printed material for growing in, but you were thinking there, I guess, about insects and mammals, and how do you create different environments that you can drop into natural ecosystems? Yeah. Well, I'm working on a project with Stanislav as well, which is actually more like near surface ecology, so mosses and
just like that 5 centimeters of surfaces in an urban context. So it's mainly his project, but I'm involved with it through a couple of other people as well. So I think there's something really interesting about that biodiversity and not just for our own use or benefit, but also like, you know, what can we contribute to their benefit, or because we co-inhabit this planet, so you know we would benefit together from it, and it's more like a life support system maybe, or new opportunities, and also changing our habits and way how we engage with it.
Exactly, and it sort of links to the in your portal, Masa, you had the butterfly as the kind of link, and it seems very similar in that spirit. And Rachel, do you think this kind of stuff is useful in the context of the policy work that you're doing in some way?
Yeah, I think it is. So I think one of the things that's really interesting is how do you use technologies to help people envision alternate possibilities and pathways. One of the challenges in doing this sort of work is to get people to somehow step out of the thinking about the now, and to be we often find people quite constrained by that, by what now looks like. And we use different ways, sometimes video mashups and things that we put together in addition to other future scenarios, to try to kind of take people into different possible alternatives. And I think it's really interesting to think about how we might be able to use technologies to do that as well, and open up those spaces for alternate ways of thinking about the problems and what alternate solutions might be.
Absolutely. And I mean, Yuichiro, this is also then links back to your original starting point about how people imagine the cities around them and how they can be involved. But do you see any interesting parallels here as well?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I see a lot of like a potential for collaboration. You know, like I didn't talk about it today, but we are building this like an online platform for collective decision making regarding urbanism. So you know, like Rachel was talking about how like you had to do workshop online because of COVID, and you had some difficulties, and maybe you can like talk about like how we can like design platforms, the user interface to, of course, it won't beat the real thing, you know, nothing beats gathering in person, but whether we can recreate that experience online. And of course, you know, I was like very interested in what Rochus was doing with 3D printing as well. And, you know, I think there's a lot of like interesting potential here. Like, it'll be interesting to learn about how like a cynical culture and the policy kind of like, what will happen if those things get together as well. Like, you know, like Japan is always talking about the food security and food policy because we import all of our food. Yeah, I don't know, like, yeah, there seems to be yeah, it's a bit too short today, no?
No, I know, but I think also we're not gonna figure out the answers right now. So we just want to frame some questions or some starting points, and then we can discuss further afterwards. Maybe we even do another session. But so we have this kind of we have these housing and environments, the 3D printed ones you talked about. We have this online platform around decision making, which also the virtual reality understanding of country is interesting in that context too, as well as the policy making workshops that you've done, Rachel, and then linking the work that Masa is describing. I mean, there's numerous touch points there, whether it's the capacity of food bowl systems, which of course then links straight across to Rachel's work again. How do we understand how much food we could produce and where we might produce it? And your work on the top of Mori building, you know, that's immensely interesting to places like Melbourne, where we also have a lot of those kinds of spaces. We have fewer earthquakes usually, but sometimes occasionally an earthquake. This First Nations and traditional farming techniques, that's really interesting. And of course, it's been completely devalued in Melbourne in the last 200 years, but is moving quite rapidly around Indigenous food culture and understanding of the potential of that. So yeah, I think I've already got a notebook full of 1 million notes. So I think let's create a document, we'll share it. I think, like I said, there's 6 or 7 crossover points already. Thank you so much for today. I'm sorry it was short and sweet, but at the same time, it enabled everybody to at least put something on the table. And I think we can already see there's something to follow up afterwards. So I think with that, I'll say thank you to Rochus and Rachel from this side. And thanks to you, Masa and Yuichiro, as usual. Arigatou gozaimasu. And I'll see you again soon. Yuichiro, you and I should talk about our next steps here, but I think that closes for today. That's okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah,
thanks
this
everybody.
was very, very productive.
Online.
Yes,
maybe
exactly.
at some point in person.
Next time in Kyoto or Melbourne. Okay, goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.